Hugh Nibley's book, The Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri in Egyptian Endowment. This is the second revised, expanded, corrected edition. Many, many dozens of scholars have checked all of the footnotes in this book. Even Hugh Nibley's own daughter, who claimed falsely that he made up 90% of his footnotes, hasn't got a clue what she's talking about. Every footnote in this book has been triple checked by Egyptologists, by Hebraic scholars, by Greek scholars. They didn't include any footnotes that had any question marks on them. So what he's saying in this book is what the scholars said as he quoted them. You can be assured of that. This is a spectacular new edition, because the criticism against Nibley is that he misused his sources, or he mistranslated stuff all the time, or he was just wrong, he made things up. In this new corrected book, that's not the case, and there's thousands of scholars that he quotes. In his book he says, every good translator, this is on page 60 and 61, every good translator will tell you that after the aids and the implements at his disposal, including his own long training, having been brought to bear on some kind of an ancient text, in the last analysis, what counts is the scholars' and translators' own feelings for things that make a convincing translation. Without intuition, a translator could never make it. Now, there's an interesting thought. It's the scholar's intuition about what the text might mean, but they still don't know if that's the correct meaning. He's going on his feelings. That's interesting. That's Alan Gardner discussed that in his article, The Eloquent Peasant, in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology for 1923 on page 6. He said, if truly scientific translation were possible, machine translation would have been perfected long ago. But any of us know who have translated that if you use an electronic translator, I have one, and they don't work. It does not get the meanings across, even though it gives a wooden, literal word-for-word translation. Translation machines don't work. In the end, it is the translator's own imponderable intuition that is his claim to distinction. The most learned linguists, now get this, the most learned linguists do not make the best translators. The uncanny skill of a Scaliger, a Hicks, a George Smith, or Francis Lewin Griffith could divine the meaning of texts before which science and scholarship were helpless. It's fascinating that we still go on our gut feelings about the meaning. And that's hardly scientific. There is no such thing as a perfect scientific translation. There's something to think about, isn't it? He further says on page 61, even while they deplore anything that smacks of the mysterious, or anything that defies cold logic, no scholars are more keenly aware of the intuitive nature of translation than the Egyptologists. And he quotes many of them to show this. They constantly mention it. No one has ever worked harder to achieve a foolproof scientific method of rendering Egyptian texts than Sir Alan Gardner. And yet, you want to hear what his final conclusion was? He says, the only basis we can have for preferring one rendering to another rendering, when once the exigencies of grammar and dictionary have been satisfied, and of course these leave a large margin for differences, divergencies, the only basis we have is our intuitive appreciation of the trend of the ancient writer's mind. A very precarious basis, everyone will admit. We still don't know what the texts mean because we can't get to the author's mind. Yet, we're still trying to explore that. Note that this most conservative of Egyptologists leads us right to the Wilhelmowitz-Mühlendorf's concept of a translation, where they said the whole idea of a translation is a transfer of the meaning from an ancient mind to a modern mind. And all we have to go on for that is our own intuition of what the ancients might have been thinking. We don't have final certitude in anything that's been translated yet from the ancient world. Nowhere is this more prominent than in the Egyptological literature. That's the astonishing thing. Writing nearly 4 decades before Sir Alan Gardner, Edward Neville points out that the assumption of a perfectly correct translation on scholarly scientific principles can only lead to frustration. Are you getting this? This is very interesting. We have perhaps missed the meaning because we have always broken the expression down into its component parts, and then we've translated each of those elements literally, and this has led us down the wrong path. That's Edward Neville who said that. Analysis can be destructive. Analysis can be destructive. What's been more analyzed than the Joseph Smith papyri? But it leads to destruction because the reason why is because this sets a definite limit on the claims of scholarship. The key to Egyptian is not to be found in a grammar book or a dictionary. It depends on knowing the way of thinking of the ancient East. And as I've noted, even in the Bible, we still don't know that thinking. We're getting there somewhat. But new analysis and new context and new translations are coming out absolutely daily in the area of biblical scholarship, of Egyptian materials, of the Mesopotamian, of the Ugaritic, of the Akkadian, of the Egyptian, of the Babylonian, of the Assyrian, of the Hebrew, of the Greek, of the Chaldean. It goes on and on and on. The Phoenician, the Arabic, it's constantly being redone because we don't know yet. According to Hermann Juncker, this still eludes us, the knowledge of what the ancient Near Eastern mind was thinking. How can we be expected to know what the Egyptians had in mind when even the Egyptian scribes themselves in the ancient times had difficulties in understanding what they were writing? Now, there's a concept for you. Not only are we in the dark, but the people who recorded this information anciently on the papyri didn't know what they were thinking. They didn't know what they were writing. They couldn't comprehend the texts themselves. That's according to the Egyptologist Hermann Juncker. Wow. How can we escape? How can we escape the absurd conclusion of many an Egyptologist that the Egyptians took a willful delight in what was incomprehensible? They only hope is to follow Professor Hans Bonnet's advice. Here's what Hans Bonnet says. Every student should get the feeling for the complex reality of the textual content. Yes, but how? How do we get that feeling? By cultivating an infinite naivete, a massive shedding of one's own intellectual habits is what Philip Duchesne answered. And what anti-Mormon critic is ever going to do that? Who among the anti-Mormon critics are ever going to shed their own intellectual habits of assuming Joseph Smith was always wrong? There's your challenge for you. Philip Duchesne says that's what we have to do. He says, after learning everything that can be learned about the Egyptians, Of course, that wipes out the anti-Mormon critics. They don't know anything about the Egyptians. And that wipes out about 99% of we LDS people, too, because we don't bother to learn them either.